Every 15 minutes, a wild animal dies from illegal traps in America's wilderness. Thomas Mitchell had recited that statistic countless times to park visitors, his voice steady and professional. Until today, when numbers became flesh and blood and agonized roars that shattered the morning silence of Oregon's Cascade Mountains. The massive black bear hung suspended in the steel leg-hold trap, 400 pounds of muscle and fur twisted in impossible angles, blood pooled beneath its mangled paw, dark against the forest floor. Thomas's coffee thermos slipped from his trembling fingers, the metallic clang echoing through the trees like a gunshot. This wasn't supposed to happen here, not in protected territory. His grandmother Eleanor's words echoed in his memory. Sometimes God puts broken things in our path to heal our own hearts. The bear's golden eyes met his, not with rage, but with something that made Thomas's chest tighten. Recognition. Trust. A desperate plea from one soul to another. Who had done this? And how many others were suffering in silence? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Thomas Mitchell had never imagined his life would unravel so completely at 42. The divorce papers still sat on his kitchen table, Sarah's signature a stark reminder of promises broken and dreams deferred. She'd left 3 months ago, taking nothing but her medical textbooks and the hope they'd once shared for children who never came. "You love those animals more than you love me," had been her parting words, delivered with the quiet devastation that only truth could carry. Now, staring at the wounded bear, Thomas understood she'd been right, but not in the way she'd meant. The modest cabin he shared with his grandmother Eleanor, perched on the edge of Cascade National Forest, where Thomas worked as a wildlife biologist. It was a job that paid enough to cover the basics, but left him drowning in the medical bills that kept piling up. Eleanor's condition was worsening, moments of confusion stretching longer each day, though she fought fiercely to hide it. The early-stage Alzheimer's diagnosis had come with a $200,000 price tag for experimental treatments insurance wouldn't cover. Eleanor Mitchell had raised Thomas after his parents died in a car crash when he was 12. At 74, she still moved with the purposeful grace of the nurse she'd been for 40 years, though her hands trembled more each morning. She'd dreamed once of being a veterinarian back in 1967, but the dean at Oregon State had laughed her out of his office. "Women belong in nursing, not cutting up animals," he'd said. She'd settled for healing people instead, but Thomas had seen her face light up whenever injured wildlife wandered onto their property. "Kindness is never wasted, Tommy," she'd tell him, bandaging a bird's wing or feeding an orphaned raccoon. "Sometimes the things we save end up saving us right back." The financial pressure was crushing. Thomas worked double shifts, conducting surveys and writing environmental impact reports, but it was never enough. The bank had already sent 2 foreclosure notices. Eleanor pretended not to notice, but Thomas caught her sometimes, sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread before her like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Sarah had tried to help before the divorce, working extra shifts at the pediatric ward, her gentle hands equally skilled with crying babies and wounded hearts. She'd understood his dedication to wildlife conservation, had even fallen in love with his passion for protecting creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. But passion didn't pay medical bills or fill the empty nursery they'd painted yellow with such hope. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days protecting animals while his own family fell apart. Sarah had wanted children, stability, a husband who came home for dinner. Instead, she'd gotten a man who disappeared into the wilderness for weeks, chasing data and protecting habitats while his marriage withered. Now, faced with this suffering bear, Thomas felt the weight of every choice that had led him here. His radio crackled with static, Eleanor's voice floating through. "Tommy, "You missed breakfast again, honey. I made your favorite pancakes." The gentle confusion in her tone told him it was happening again, another piece of his grandmother slipping away while he stood helpless in the forest, staring at pain he might actually be able to fix. The bear's labored breathing filled the morning air as Thomas approached, each step calculated and deliberate. He'd encountered hundreds of black bears in his 15 years as a wildlife biologist, but never one caught in such a vicious trap. The steel jaws had clamped around the animal's left front paw with devastating precision, the serrated edges cutting deep into flesh and bone. Blood had pooled and darkened in the pine needles below, creating a macabre painting against the forest floor. What struck Thomas immediately was the bear's size. Easily 400 pounds of muscle and fur, a magnificent male in his prime. But more unsettling was the animal's behavior. Instead of the frenzied panic he'd expected, the bear watched him with an intelligence that made Thomas's skin crawl. Those golden brown eyes tracked his movement with an awareness that seemed almost human, and when Thomas raised his hand in a calming gesture, the bear's ears flicked forward in what looked remarkably like recognition. "Easy, big guy," Thomas whispered, surprised by the tremor in his own voice. "I'm here to help." The bear huffed softly, a sound that carried no aggression, only exhaustion and pain. Thomas had never heard anything like it. In all his years studying ursine behavior, he'd never witnessed a wild bear respond to human speech with such apparent understanding. The animal's massive head tilted slightly, watching as Thomas slowly reached into his field pack for his emergency medical kit. The trap itself was a nightmare of engineering, a heavy-duty leg-hold snare designed not just to capture, but to cripple. Thomas recognized the manufacturer, Steel Grip Industries, a company that had been banned from producing wildlife control devices after a series of lawsuits. Someone was using illegal equipment, which meant this wasn't accidental poaching, but deliberate, calculated cruelty. Working the release mechanism required Thomas to position himself within striking distance of claws that could disembowel him with a single swipe. His hands shook as he inserted the pry bar into the trap's hinge, acutely aware that one wrong move could trigger the bear's defensive instincts. But as he worked, something extraordinary happened. The bear seemed to understand what Thomas was trying to do and actually shifted its weight to help, lifting the trapped paw slightly to give Thomas better access to the mechanism. "Jesus," Thomas breathed, pausing mid-motion. "You know what I'm doing, don't you?" The bear made that same soft, huffing sound, and Thomas could have sworn he saw something like gratitude in those ancient eyes. With a metallic screech that echoed through the forest, the trap finally released its hold. The bear's paw was mangled but intact, and Thomas quickly applied pressure bandages from his kit, working with the kind of desperate efficiency he'd learned treating injured wildlife. Throughout the entire process, the bear remained perfectly still, allowing Thomas to clean and dress the wounds as if they'd done this before. The level of trust was unprecedented in Thomas's experience. Wild black bears, even injured ones, didn't permit human contact. They fought, fled, or attacked. They didn't lie quietly while strangers performed field surgery. As Thomas finished bandaging the paw, he noticed something else that made his blood run cold. This wasn't the only trap in the area. Scattered through the surrounding trees, he could see the glint of metal, dozens of similar devices hidden among the undergrowth. Someone had turned this section of protected forest into a killing field. The bear struggled to its feet, testing the injured paw with obvious pain but determination. Thomas expected the animal to disappear into the forest, but instead it turned back to face him. For a long moment, they stood there in the morning sunlight, man and beast regarding each other across the impossible gulf of species. Then the bear did something that would haunt Thomas for weeks to come. It raised its good paw and touched its chest, then pointed that same paw toward Thomas. The gesture was unmistakable, a sign language expression of gratitude that no wild bear should have known. Thomas's radio crackled to life, startling them both. "Unit 7, this is base. Report your status." The mechanical voice shattered the moment, and the bear immediately began backing away, its eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "This is Unit 7, Thomas managed, his voice barely steady. I'm fine. Continuing survey." The bear paused at the tree line, looking back one final time. In that gaze, Thomas saw something that chilled him more than the illegal traps or the calculated cruelty of whoever had set them. He saw recognition. This bear knew humans intimately, had lived among them, trusted them. Someone had loved this animal, raised it, taught it to communicate, and now someone else was trying to kill it. As the bear disappeared into the shadows, Thomas realized his life had just changed forever. This wasn't just about wildlife conservation anymore. This was personal. And somewhere in these mountains, people were hunting an animal that had once been someone's family. Thomas's hands trembled as he drove the winding mountain road home. The bear's golden eyes burned into his memory. The illegal traps, the sign language gesture, the impossible intelligence. None of it made sense according to everything he'd learned about wildlife behavior. But the bandages soaked with blood in his pack told him it was all terrifyingly real. Eleanor was waiting on the porch when he pulled into their gravel driveway, her silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight. At 74, she still had the posture of the nurse she'd been for 4 decades, though Thomas noticed she gripped the porch railing more tightly these days. Her blue eyes, once sharp enough to spot a patient's needs from across a hospital ward, now sometimes carried the confused haze that broke his heart. "You're late, Tommy," she said, her voice carrying that slight tremor that had developed over the past months. "I was worried." "Sorry, Grandma." Had an unusual situation in the field. Thomas climbed the steps, noting how Eleanor's gaze lingered on the dried blood on his jacket. Even with her condition progressing, her medical instincts remained razor-sharp. "Someone hurt?" she asked, automatically reaching for his hands to examine them for injuries. "A bear, caught in an illegal trap." Thomas found himself studying his grandmother's reaction. Eleanor had always had an almost mystical connection with injured animals, a gentleness that seemed to calm even the most frightened creatures. "Strangest thing, Grandma. This bear, it acted like it knew sign language." Eleanor's hands stilled on his wrists, her eyes sharpening with sudden focus. "Bears can be taught to communicate, Tommy. They're far more intelligent than most people realize." Her voice carried a certainty that surprised him. "What did it say?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Eleanor spoke as if bears using sign language was perfectly normal, not the impossible thing he'd witnessed. It said thank you. At least I think it did." A knowing smile crossed Eleanor's weathered face. "Of course it did. You saved its life." She patted his cheek with the same gentle touch she'd used to comfort him through childhood nightmares. "Animals remember kindness, honey. Sometimes better than people do." Before Thomas could process her words fully, the sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. His stomach clenched as he recognized Sarah's white Honda Civic pulling up the driveway. They'd agreed she would come by today to collect the last of her belongings: medical journals, family photos, the coffee maker she'd bought for their 5th anniversary. Sarah stepped out of the car, her black hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she wore during long shifts at the pediatric ward. Even after 3 months of separation, seeing her made Thomas's chest tighten with longing and regret. She'd always been beautiful in an understated way, but stress had carved new lines around her eyes, and he knew he was responsible for most of them. "Thomas?" she nodded, maintaining the careful distance they'd established since the divorce papers were signed. "Eleanor, You look wonderful." Eleanor's face lit up with genuine joy. "Sarah, sweetheart, I was hoping you'd come by. I made that green tea cake you love." Thomas watched Sarah's professional mask slip for just a moment, revealing the pain underneath. Sarah had always adored Eleanor, had spent hours listening to stories from the older woman's nursing days and sharing her own experiences from the children's hospital. The divorce hadn't just ended their marriage, it had severed Sarah from the grandmother she'd never had. "I can't stay long," Sarah said softly. "I just came to get my things." "Nonsense," Eleanor declared with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You'll have cake and tell me about work. Tommy was just telling me about a bear he helped today. Used sign language to say thank you, can you imagine?" Sarah's eyebrows rose and she looked at Thomas with the expression he remembered from their married days, part concern, part exasperation. "Sign language. Thomas, you've been working too many double shifts. The stress is making you see things." "I know how it sounds," Thomas began, but Eleanor interrupted him. "There's nothing unusual about it, dear. Bears have been taught to communicate for decades. During my nursing days, I worked with a rehabilitation center that had several signing bears. Beautiful creatures, really. Much more emotional than people give them credit for." The casual way Eleanor discussed signing bears made both Thomas and Sarah stare at her. Thomas felt a chill of recognition, another piece of his grandmother's past that didn't quite fit with what he thought he knew about her life. "Grandma," Thomas said carefully, "you never mentioned working with a rehabilitation center." Eleanor's face clouded with confusion for a moment, the fog that had been settling over her memories more frequently. "Didn't I? Well, it was a long time ago. Before you came to live with me." She touched her temple, the gesture Thomas had learned to dread. "Sometimes the details get mixed up, but I remember the bears, especially one named Benny. Such a sweet boy." Sarah's professional instincts kicked in, and she moved closer to Eleanor, gently taking the older woman's pulse at her wrist. "Are you feeling all right, Eleanor? Any dizziness or confusion?" "I'm fine, dear. Just old." Eleanor's smile was brave but brittle. "My mind wanders sometimes, but my heart remembers what matters." The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken concerns. Thomas realized that Sarah's medical training had probably recognized Eleanor's symptoms long before he'd been willing to acknowledge them. Another failure on his part. He'd been so focused on protecting wildlife that he'd missed the signs of his grandmother's deteriorating condition right in front of him. "Thomas," Sarah said quietly, "we need to talk. About Eleanor. About a lot of things." As if summoned by the tension in their voices, a deep, huffing sound echoed from the forest edge behind their cabin. All three of them froze, recognizing the call of a large animal. Thomas's blood ran cold as he realized what it meant. The bear had followed him home. The massive black bear emerged from the tree line with a deliberate slowness that spoke of both pain and caution. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the white bandages still wrapped around the animal's left paw, stark against its dark fur. Behind him he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath and Eleanor's soft exclamation of wonder. "Nobody move," Thomas whispered, though every instinct screamed at him to get between the bear and the two women. "Sarah, take Eleanor inside, slowly." But Eleanor stepped forward instead, her weathered hands clasped in front of her chest. "Oh, you beautiful boy," she murmured, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she'd used with frightened patience. "You came to say hello, didn't you?" The bear's ears perked up at her voice, and it took another careful step closer. Thomas felt his world tilt sideways as he watched his grandmother, a woman who'd been showing increasing signs of confusion and memory loss, communicate with a 400-pound predator as if they were old friends. "Grandma, please step back," Thomas urged, but Eleanor was already moving forward, her steps sure and confident in a way he hadn't seen in months. "It's all right, Tommy. He's not here to hurt anyone." Eleanor extended her hand palm up, and the bear actually approached, sniffing delicately at her fingers. "You remember me, don't you, sweetheart?" Sarah grabbed Thomas's arm, her fingernails digging into his jacket. "Thomas, this is insane. We need to call wildlife control right now." "No!" The word exploded from Thomas with surprising force. "They'll relocate him or put him down. Look at him, Sarah. Really look." The bear had settled onto his haunches beside Eleanor, allowing her to gently examine the bandaged paw. As Thomas watched in amazement, his grandmother began moving her hands in slow, deliberate gestures, sign language. The bear responded with his own careful movements, his massive paws surprisingly graceful as they formed recognizable signs. "My God," Sarah breathed. "He's actually communicating." "His name is Benny," Eleanor announced, her face bright with joy and clarity. "He's been hurt, but he's healing. Aren't you, precious boy?" The bear, Benny, touched his chest with his good paw, then pointed toward Eleanor. The gesture was unmistakably one of affection and recognition. Thomas felt his knees go weak as the implications crashed over him. This wasn't just any bear. This was an animal who'd been raised by humans, who'd learned to trust and love and communicate. And someone had put him in that brutal trap. "Grandma," Thomas said carefully, "how do you know his name?" Eleanor's expression flickered with confusion, the fog rolling back over her sharp blue eyes. I'm not sure. It just came to me when I saw him." She looked down at her hands as if surprised to find them moving in sign language. "I used to know these signs, didn't I? For the bears at the center?" Sarah moved closer, her medical training overriding her fear. "Eleanor, what center? You mentioned it earlier, but you've never told us about working with bears." "There was a place," Eleanor said slowly, her words coming with obvious effort. "Before Tommy came to live with me, we helped animals that couldn't be released back to the wild. Bears that had been raised as pets, circus animals, creatures that were too humanized to survive alone." Her hands continued signing almost unconsciously as she spoke. "There was a young man who brought us bears sometimes. His name was Daniel. He had a little one called Benny that he'd raised from a cub." Thomas felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see. "Grandma, when was this? What happened to Daniel?" "I don't remember," Eleanor whispered, tears starting to form in her eyes. "So many things are fuzzy now, but I remember Benny. He was so smart, so gentle. Daniel loved him like a son." Benny seemed to sense Eleanor's distress. He moved closer, very gently pressing his massive head against her shoulder in a gesture of comfort that made Sarah gasp. The sight of this enormous predator offering solace to a confused elderly woman was simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking. "We can't keep him," Sarah said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Thomas, this is a wild animal. Even if he was raised by humans, he weighs 400 pounds and has claws that could kill any of us." "He's not wild," Thomas replied, watching as Benny carefully avoided putting weight on his injured paw. "Look at him, Sarah. He's domesticated. Someone taught him to trust humans, to communicate, to love. And then someone tried to kill him." The sound of an approaching vehicle made them all freeze. Thomas recognized the rumble of a diesel engine even before the white pickup truck came into view around the bend in their driveway. His blood turned to ice as he saw the official emblem on the door: Oregon Fish and Wildlife Department. "Dr. Mitchell?" The uniformed officer who stepped out of the truck was someone Thomas knew. Jake Morrison, a fellow biologist who'd worked with the department for over a decade. but Jake's usual friendly demeanor was replaced by grim professionalism. "We received reports of an injured bear in this area. I'm here to assess the situation." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Eleanor and Benny, his mind racing. "Jake, I can explain." "Jesus Christ, Thomas!" Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the tranquilizer gun on his belt as he spotted Benny. "What the hell are you doing?" "Get away from that animal right now." "He's not dangerous," Thomas said, fighting to keep his voice calm. "Jake, this bear has been living with humans. He's domesticated." "There's no such thing as a domesticated bear, and you know it," Jake snapped, his radio crackling to life in his hands. "I need backup at the Mitchell residence. We have a dangerous wildlife situation." "No, wait!" Sarah stepped forward, surprising everyone. "Officer Morrison, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from Portland Children's Hospital. This animal is clearly exhibiting learned behaviors consistent with extensive human contact. He's calm, responsive, and showing no signs of aggression." Benny, as if understanding the conversation, slowly raised his good paw and signed what Thomas now recognized as "friend" in American Sign Language. Jake's eyes widened in shock. "Son of a bitch," he whispered. "He really is signing." "His name is Benny," Eleanor said, her voice stronger now. "He belongs with a young man named Daniel. They've been separated, and Benny is trying to find his way home." Thomas saw Jake's expression change, confusion replacing hostility. "Daniel? Ma'am, are you talking about Daniel Thompson, the missing person case from 2 years ago?" Eleanor's face lit up with sudden clarity. "Yes, Daniel Thompson. He brought animals to our center. He had permits for Benny, special licensing for educational programs. They were partners." "Mrs. Mitchell," Jake said gently, "Daniel Thompson has been missing for 2 years. His father Marcus has been searching for him ever since, and there's been no record of any legal permits for keeping bears." The radio on Jake's belt crackled again. "Unit 4, this is dispatch. Be advised we have reports of armed individuals in the Cascade Forest area. Possible poaching operation. Proceed with caution." Thomas felt his stomach drop. The illegal traps, the wounded bear, and now reports of armed poachers. Everything was connected, and Benny was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than they'd realized. "Jake," Thomas said urgently, "those traps I found today, they're part of something bigger. Someone's been systematically hunting bears in protected territory. Benny here was caught in one of their snares." Before Jake could respond, another sound made them all turn toward the forest. The rumble of multiple engines getting closer. Through the trees, Thomas could see the glint of sunlight on metal and glass. Vehicles were approaching through the forest, and they weren't following any established roads. Benny suddenly became agitated, rising to his full height and huffing in distress. His good paw moved rapidly in sign language, repeating the same gesture over and over. Thomas recognized it as the sign for danger. "Everyone inside now," Jake commanded, his hand on his tranquilizer gun. This situation just became a lot more complicated. As they moved toward the house, Eleanor turned back to Benny. "Come on, sweetheart. You're safe with us." To Thomas's amazement, the massive bear followed them toward the porch, moving with the careful obedience of a well-trained dog. Whatever was coming through those trees, Benny knew it meant trouble. And for the first time since finding the bear in that trap, Thomas realized they might all be in more danger than they'd imagined. The sound of engines grew louder, and through the forest Thomas caught glimpses of men with rifles. The hunters had found them. The first shot shattered the peaceful afternoon like thunder, sending bark flying from the pine tree just inches from where Thomas stood. Jake Morrison's training kicked in instantly as he shoved Eleanor and Sarah toward the cabin door while drawing his service weapon. "Get inside, now!" Jake shouted, his radio crackling with urgent dispatch calls about armed suspects in the area. Benny reared up on his hind legs, his massive frame blocking the porch as he positioned himself between the family and the approaching vehicles. His injured paw hung useless at his side, but his remaining 3 limbs moved with deadly purpose as he scanned the tree line for threats. 3 pickup trucks burst through the undergrowth, their modifications obvious even at a distance: reinforced bumpers, rifle racks, and the kind of heavy-duty equipment used for hunting large game. The lead vehicle bore no license plates, and its windshield was tinted dark enough to hide the occupants. "Federal wildlife officers!" Jake called out, his badge held high. "Drop your weapons and identify yourselves." The response came in the form of another rifle shot, this one close enough to Thomas that he felt the bullets wake against his cheek. The message was clear. These weren't casual poachers who would scatter at the sight of authority. Eleanor stumbled as Sarah tried to guide her toward the door, her confusion returning in the face of violence and chaos. "I don't understand," she whispered, her hands trembling. "Why are they shooting? Benny isn't hurting anyone." "Because they're not here to arrest him, Grandma," Thomas said grimly, finally understanding the scope of what they faced. "They're here to kill him." The lead truck's door slammed open, and a man emerged who made Thomas's blood run cold. Tall and lean, with graying hair and cold blue eyes, he carried a high-powered rifle with the easy familiarity of someone who'd used it many times before. But it was the military bearing and the way he moved, calculated, professional, lethal, that marked him as far more dangerous than any common poacher. "Marcus Thompson," Jake breathed, recognizing the man from missing person reports. "Daniel's father." Marcus Thompson stood beside his truck like a general surveying a battlefield, his rifle trained not on Benny but on Thomas himself. His voice carried across the clearing with deadly calm. "You have something that belongs to me, Dr. Mitchell. I've come to collect it." "That bear doesn't belong to anyone," Thomas shouted back, though he kept his hands visible as Jake had instructed. "He's a living creature, not property." Marcus's laugh was bitter and devoid of warmth. "You have no idea what that animal represents? No idea what I've sacrificed to find him?" His finger moved to the rifle's trigger. "Daniel gave his life protecting that bear. The least I can do is honor his memory by finishing what he started." Eleanor suddenly stepped out from behind Sarah, her confusion replaced by startling clarity. "Marcus Thompson?" she called out, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd commanded hospital wards during medical emergencies. "I remember you now. You brought Daniel to our rehabilitation center when he was just a boy. You were so proud of how gentle he was with the animals." Marcus's rifle wavered slightly, his cold demeanor cracking. "Eleanor Mitchell, I thought you might be dead by now." "Not yet, though some days I wish I was," Eleanor replied with brutal honesty. "Marcus, what happened to your boy? What happened to Daniel?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas could see the war playing out on Marcus's weathered face, grief, rage, and something that might have been regret. The other men who'd emerged from the trucks held their positions but seemed uncertain without clear orders from their leader. "He died because of that animal," Marcus finally said, his voice breaking on the words. 2 years ago, camping in the Cascades, something spooked Benny in the night, sent him into a panic. Daniel tried to calm him down, and the bear—" Marcus's voice failed him completely. Benny made a low, mournful sound and began signing frantically with his good paw. Thomas recognized some of the gestures. Sorry, sad, love, repeated over and over with desperate urgency. "He's trying to tell you something," Thomas said quietly. "Marcus, look at him, really look. Does that seem like an animal that would hurt someone he loved?" "I found Daniel's body 3 days after they disappeared," Marcus continued, his rifle now pointed at the ground as memories consumed him. "Mauled beyond recognition. And that animal was gone, vanished into the wilderness like the wild beast he really is." Eleanor's gasp was audible across the clearing. "Oh, Marcus! Oh, you poor man! But you're wrong about what happened." "How could you possibly know?" Marcus demanded, his grief transforming back into rage. "You weren't there." "Because I know Benny," Eleanor said simply, "and I knew your son. Daniel would never have taken Benny camping without proper precautions. Something else happened out there, something that had nothing to do with bear attacks." Jake's radio crackled with an urgent message. "All units, be advised we have confirmed reports of illegal bear hunting operation in the Cascade area, multiple suspects armed and dangerous, possible connection to organized wildlife trafficking." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His face went white as the implications sank in. "Wildlife trafficking," he whispered. "The other bodies we found in the forest. The missing hikers." "You found other bodies?" Thomas asked, pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a horrifying picture. "3 in the past 2 years, all mauled, all in areas where Benny had been spotted." Marcus's voice was hollow now. I assumed he'd gone feral after Daniel died." Benny suddenly became agitated, his attention focused on the forest behind the trucks. His signing became frantic, the same gesture repeated over and over. Danger! Run! Hide! The bear's behavior sent chills down Thomas's spine. "There's someone else out there," Jake said, raising his weapon as he followed Benny's gaze. "Marcus, your men need to stand down now. We're all in danger." The crack of branches and the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the undergrowth confirmed Jake's warning. But these weren't more vehicles or official personnel. These sounds came from something moving on foot through dense forest, with the skill of experienced hunters. "They followed us!" one of Marcus's men called out, his voice tight with fear. "Boss, we led them right to the bear." Marcus spun toward his subordinate. "Who followed us?" "The trafficking ring. The ones who've been setting the traps, harvesting organs from protected species. They've been tracking Benny for months." The revelation hit Thomas like a lightning bolt. The illegal traps, the murdered hikers, Daniel's death. It was all connected to a wildlife trafficking operation that used bear attacks as cover for their murders. And Benny wasn't the killer. He was a witness who'd been running for his life. "Marcus," Thomas called out urgently, "we need to work together. If those people get their hands on Benny—" "They won't," Marcus said grimly, raising his rifle again. But this time it wasn't pointed at the bear or at Thomas. It was aimed at the forest where shadows moved between the trees. "Nobody else dies because of my failures." Eleanor moved closer to Benny, her hands gentle on his massive shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart. We won't let them hurt you. Not anymore." The bear leaned into her touch, his signing now focused on a single repeated message: family. He wasn't just communicating, he was claiming them, accepting them as his pack. After 2 years of running and hiding, Benny had found people he trusted enough to defend. "Jake," Thomas said quietly, "how long until backup arrives?" 20 minutes, maybe more. The terrain's rough, and they don't know exactly where we are. 20 minutes. Thomas looked at Eleanor's gentle smile, at Sarah's determined expression, at Benny's massive form standing guard over all of them. 20 minutes to protect a family that had somehow formed in the space of a single afternoon. In the forest, the hunters were getting closer, and this time, they weren't just after the bear. The sound of a rifle bolt being worked echoed from the trees, followed by a voice that made Marcus Thompson's face go deadly pale. "Well, well, the whole family's here. This is going to be easier than I thought." The real killers had arrived, and they weren't planning to leave any witnesses. The man who emerged from the forest moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to hunting both animals and humans. Vincent Carrera was everything the missing person reports had failed to capture. Not just a poacher, but a killer who turned wildlife trafficking into an art form of calculated brutality. His expensive tactical gear and military-grade weapons marked him as someone with serious financial backing and zero regard for human life. "Marcus Thompson," Vincent called out, his voice carrying mock friendliness that made Thomas's skin crawl. "Still chasing ghosts, I see. Still blaming that poor bear for what I did to your boy." The color drained from Marcus's face as the truth hit him like a physical blow. "You killed Daniel." "Killed him? Marcus, your son died trying to protect that animal from me. Brave kid, I'll give him that. Stupid, but brave." Vincent's rifle remained casually pointed at the group on the porch. "Did you really think a bear could make those kinds of precise cuts? Your boy bled out slow, Marcus, and he watched me corner his precious Benny before he died." Eleanor's sharp intake of breath cut through the clearing like a blade. The elderly woman's hands moved instinctively to comfort Benny, who had begun to tremble at the sound of Vincent's voice. The bear's massive frame pressed closer to the porch, his good paw signing frantically, "Bad man. Hurt Daniel. Run." "You son of a bitch," Marcus whispered, his rifle swinging toward Vincent. 2 years I've been hunting the wrong target." Vincent's laugh was cold and calculating. The beauty of it was how perfectly it worked. Blame the bear and nobody looks for the real killer. "Meanwhile, I've harvested organs from dozens of protected species, all under the cover of supposed bear attacks. Your son's death was just the first domino to fall." Thomas felt his world tilt as the full scope of the horror became clear. Daniel Thompson hadn't been killed by Benny. He'd died protecting the bear from a monster who used wildlife trafficking to fund serial murder. And for 2 years, Marcus had been hunting the only witness to his son's heroic sacrifice. "The other hikers," Jake said, pieces clicking into place. "The ones found mauled in the forest. You killed them all." "Business is business, Officer Morrison. Bear gallbladders fetch $50,000 each on the Asian black market. Hearts, livers, paws, it all adds up. And when hikers stumble onto my operations—" Vincent shrugged with sociopathic indifference. "Well, bear attacks explain a lot of convenient deaths." Sarah stepped protectively in front of Eleanor, her medical training warring with maternal instincts she'd never had the chance to develop. "You're insane. These are innocent people, innocent animals." "Innocent?" Vincent's eyes glittered with malice. "Lady, there's no such thing as innocent in my world. There's profitable and unprofitable. That bear represents $250,000 in harvested organs, plus the bonus for eliminating the only witness to my operations." Eleanor suddenly spoke up, her voice carrying the steel that had commanded respect in hospital emergency rooms for 4 decades. "Vincent Carrera, you are a coward and a disgrace to the human race. That boy and his bear showed more courage and love in a single day than you've shown in your entire miserable existence." "Shut up, old woman," Vincent snarled, his casual demeanor cracking. "You're all going to die anyway. Tragic bear attack just like the others. By the time anyone finds the bodies, I'll be in Mexico with enough money to retire." Benny suddenly reared up to his full height, his massive frame blocking most of the porch as he positioned himself between Vincent and the family. Despite his injured paw, the bear's presence was overwhelming. 400 pounds of protective fury that made even Vincent take a step backward. "That animal should have died in my trap," Vincent said, raising his rifle. "Just like you're all going to die now." The first shot rang out across the clearing, but it didn't come from Vincent's weapon. Marcus Thompson had found his target, his bullet catching Vincent in the shoulder and spinning him around. The trafficking leader's rifle flew from his hands as he crashed into a tree. "That's for my son, you bastard!" Marcus roared, working the bolt on his hunting rifle. But Vincent wasn't alone. His accomplices emerged from the forest like a pack of wolves, their weapons trained on the cabin. Thomas counted at least 4 more men, all armed with high-powered rifles and the cold efficiency of professional killers. Jake's radio crackled with desperate updates. "All units, shots fired at the Mitchell residence. Multiple suspects, Officer needs assistance. Help's coming, Jake said grimly, but not fast enough. Eleanor collapsed suddenly, her legs giving out as the stress and confusion overwhelmed her failing system. Sarah caught her before she hit the porch boards, checking her pulse with practiced efficiency. Her heart's racing, Sarah said urgently. She needs her medication now. Thomas felt everything falling apart at once. Eleanor was collapsing, armed killers surrounded them, and Benny, their unlikely protector, was injured and outnumbered. The bear seemed to understand the desperate situation, his signing becoming more frantic as he tried to communicate something vital. Benny knows something, Thomas realized, watching the bear's increasingly urgent gestures. He's trying to tell us how to get out of this. But as Vincent Carrera pulled himself upright against the tree, blood streaming from his wounded shoulder and murder blazing in his eyes, Thomas wondered if any of them would live long enough to understand what the bear was trying to say. The sound of more vehicles approaching through the forest announced the arrival of Vincent's backup team. The monsters who'd turned protected wilderness into a killing field had come to finish what they'd started 2 years ago. And this time, they weren't planning to leave anyone alive to tell the story. The chaos erupted like a dam bursting as Vincent's backup team opened fire on the cabin. Windows shattered, sending glass cascading across the porch where Eleanor lay unconscious in Sarah's arms. Thomas threw himself over both women as bullets splintered the wooden doorframe above their heads, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the mountain air. Benny's roar of fury shook the ground as the massive bear charged toward Vincent's position, his injured paw forgotten in the face of mortal danger to his adopted family. The sight of 400 pounds of enraged black bear descending on them sent 2 of Vincent's men scrambling for their vehicles, but the trafficking leader himself stood his ground, pulling a backup pistol from his tactical vest. "Kill the bear first!" Vincent screamed to his remaining men. "Everything else is secondary." Marcus Thompson had taken cover behind his truck, trading shots with the traffickers while trying to reach a better position. His face was etched with 2 years of grief and rage finally finding their proper target. "You want to finish this, Carrera? Let's finish it." Jake Morrison's law enforcement training took over as he coordinated their desperate defense. "Thomas, get Eleanor and Sarah inside. I'll cover you." But as Thomas tried to lift his unconscious grandmother, Eleanor's eyes fluttered open with startling clarity. Her gaze fixed on Benny, who was now wrestling with one of Vincent's men in the clearing. "Daniel's journal," she whispered urgently. "In the bear's collar. Daniel wrote everything down." "What collar, Grandma?" Thomas asked, confused. Eleanor's trembling hand pointed toward Benny's neck, where Thomas now noticed a weathered leather band hidden beneath the bear's thick fur. "Daniel documented Vincent's crimes, all of them. It's all there." The revelation hit Thomas like lightning. Daniel Thompson hadn't just been protecting his bear, he'd been gathering evidence against the trafficking ring. That's why Vincent had killed him so brutally, and why he'd spent 2 years hunting Benny. The bear wasn't just a witness. He was carrying the proof that could destroy the entire operation. Vincent had obviously heard Eleanor's words because his face contorted with desperate rage. "That goddamn journal! 2 years I've been hunting for it!" He raised his pistol toward Benny, who was still grappling with his attacker. "Should have killed you both in the forest!" Sarah had been checking Eleanor's vital signs, but now she looked up with the fierce determination Thomas remembered from their married days. "Thomas, if that bear has evidence of these crimes, we have to protect him. Those journal entries could save other animals, prevent other murders." The sound of sirens in the distance gave them all hope, but Vincent's response was swift and terrifying. He pulled what looked like a military-grade explosive device from his pack. "Federal backup means federal investigation. I won't let that happen." "He's got a grenade!" Jake shouted, recognizing the device. "Everyone down!" But instead of throwing it at the cabin, Vincent hurled the explosive toward the forest where the sirens were approaching. The blast echoed through the mountains like thunder, followed by the sound of trees crashing down. Vincent's cold smile told them everything. He'd just blocked the only road access to the cabin. "Now we finish this properly," Vincent said, reloading his weapon. "No witnesses, no evidence, no loose ends." Marcus had worked his way closer during the chaos, and now he emerged from behind a fallen log with his rifle aimed at Vincent's chest. "You killed my boy for a piece of paper?" "I killed your boy because he was weak," Vincent snarled back. "Just like you. All this sentiment over dumb animals when there's real money to be made." The gunshot that followed wasn't from Marcus's rifle. Vincent had been faster, his bullet catching Marcus in the leg and sending the grieving father sprawling. Thomas watched in horror as Vincent moved in for the kill shot, but Benny had finally broken free from his attacker and was charging across the clearing. Eleanor struggled to sit up despite Sarah's protests, her voice carrying with surprising strength. "Benny! Show them Daniel's words. Show them what your boy died for." The bear seemed to understand. Instead of attacking Vincent directly, Benny began tearing at his own collar with his good paw, the leather band coming apart to reveal a waterproof pouch sewn into the lining. Inside was a small notebook, its pages filled with Daniel Thompson's careful handwriting. Vincent's face went white as he realized what was happening. "No, that evidence dies with all of you." But Jake Morrison had been waiting for his moment. As Vincent focused on the journal, the wildlife officer tackled him from the side, both men crashing to the ground in a violent struggle for Vincent's weapon. The gun discharged wildly, its bullet punching through the cabin's front window. Thomas saw his chance and sprinted toward Benny, who was still trying to free the journal from his damaged collar. "Easy, boy. Let me help." The bear allowed Thomas to approach, his massive head lowering as Thomas carefully extracted the notebook. The pages were filled with detailed observations, locations, dates, and names, a complete record of Vincent's trafficking operation, including photographs and financial records. "This is it," Thomas breathed, flipping through pages that documented systematic slaughter of protected wildlife. "This is enough to bring down the entire network." Vincent managed to break free from Jake's grip, but now he was bleeding from multiple wounds and surrounded by his own dead or fleeing associates. Marcus had dragged himself upright and was using a tree for support, his rifle still trained on the trafficking leader. "It's over, Vincent," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his wound. "My son's words are going to bury you and everyone like you." But Vincent's eyes held the manic gleam of someone with nothing left to lose. He pulled a backup pistol from an ankle holster, its barrel swinging toward Eleanor where she sat on the porch. "If I'm going down, I'm taking the old woman with me. She knew too much anyway." The shot that rang out across the clearing came from an unexpected source. Sarah Chen Mitchell, who had never fired a weapon in her life, held Jake's backup service pistol in both hands. Her bullet caught Vincent's center mass, the trafficking leader's eyes widening in shock before he collapsed. "That's for every innocent creature you murdered?" Sarah said quietly, lowering the smoking weapon with trembling hands. Eleanor reached out and took the journal from Thomas's hands, her eyes clear and focused as she read her late patient's words. "Daniel wrote about you all in here," she said, looking at the group gathered around her. "About Marcus's love for his son, about Thomas's dedication to protecting wildlife, about Sarah's gentle heart for wounded things." He knew we'd find each other, Thomas realized, understanding dawning. Daniel planned for this. He knew that if something happened to him, Benny would lead us together. Benny settled beside Eleanor's chair, his massive head resting gently against her knee as she continued reading. The bear's eyes, which had seen so much violence and loss, now held something that looked remarkably like peace. The sound of helicopters approaching told them that federal backup had finally found an alternate route to the cabin. But the real battle was already over. Vincent Carrera lay dead, his trafficking network exposed, and Daniel Thompson's sacrifice had finally been honored. Eleanor looked up from the journal with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Daniel's last entry says that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to protect the things that matter. As the dust settled and the sirens grew louder, Thomas realized that a family had been born from the ashes of tragedy. Not the family he'd planned for, but the one that had chosen each other when it mattered most. And at the center of it all was a bear named Benny, carrying the words of a young man who'd died protecting the things he loved. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of what had once been Thomas and Sarah's modest cabin and was now the headquarters of the Daniel Thompson Wildlife Sanctuary. The bullet holes in the walls had been repaired, but they'd left a small plaque near the front door reading, "In memory of those who gave everything to protect the innocent." Eleanor sat in her favorite rocking chair on the newly expanded porch, watching Benny play with a group of visiting children from the local elementary school. The bear's injured paw had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that the kids loved to hear about. At 74, Eleanor's Alzheimer's symptoms had mysteriously stabilized since Benny's arrival, as if the bear's presence had given her mind something vital to hold on to. "Tell us again about how Benny learned sign language, Mrs. Mitchell," asked 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, her small hands already attempting the gestures Eleanor had been teaching her. "Well, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice stronger than it had been in years, "Daniel Thompson was a very special young man who understood that animals have feelings just like we do. He spent years teaching Benny to communicate because he believed every creature deserves to be heard." Thomas emerged from the sanctuary's new veterinary clinic, wiping his hands on a towel after treating a rescued fox with a broken wing. The federal investigation following Vincent Carrera's death had exposed a trafficking network spanning 3 states, leading to dozens of arrests and the rescue of hundreds of animals. The reward money, combined with donations that poured in after their story went national, had made the sanctuary possible. "How's our patient?" Sarah asked, looking up from the financial reports spread across the kitchen table. She'd turned down the job in Seattle and instead become the sanctuary's medical director, her pediatric training translating surprisingly well to caring for young animals. "Wing's healing nicely. She'll be ready for release next month." Thomas settled into the chair beside Eleanor, watching as Benny demonstrated his vocabulary to the fascinated children. The bear now knew over 300 signs, and his gentle patience with visitors had made him something of a celebrity. Marcus Thompson's voice carried across the clearing as he led a group of teenagers through the forest education trail. The former hunter had become the sanctuary's most passionate advocate for wildlife protection, his personal story of loss and redemption moving audiences across the country. The limp from his gunshot wound served as a constant reminder of the price paid for Vincent's crimes. "The really important thing to understand," Marcus was telling his group, "is that my son didn't die fighting a monster. And he died protecting something he loved from a monster. There's a big difference." Eleanor smiled as she listened to Marcus's words. The anger and grief that had consumed him for 2 years had transformed into something productive and healing. Daniel's journal hadn't just exposed the trafficking ring, it had revealed a young man's profound love for the natural world and his hope that humans could learn to coexist peacefully with wildlife. "Mrs. Mitchell?" Emma tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. "Benny's trying to tell us something." The bear was indeed signing frantically, his attention focused on the forest trail where Marcus's group was walking. Eleanor followed his gaze and smiled. "He's saying thank you, Sweet Pea. He does that sometimes when he remembers Daniel." But as Eleanor watched more closely, she realized Benny wasn't just reminiscing. The bear was responding to something specific, a young man who'd emerged from behind the group of teenagers, moving with careful, deliberate steps that spoke of recent physical therapy. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The young man was thin and scarred, his left arm in a supportive brace, but his face was unmistakably familiar. 22 years old, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's gentle smile, Daniel Thompson walked slowly but steadily toward the porch where his best friend waited. Benny's roar of joy shook the entire sanctuary as he bounded toward Daniel, his massive paws gentle as he embraced the young man he'd thought was dead. Daniel laughed through his tears, his good arm wrapping around Benny's neck as he whispered words of love and apology in the bear's ear. "That's impossible," Thomas breathed, rising from his chair. "The body Marcus found, the medical examiner's report, was a case of mistaken identity," said the federal agent who stepped out of an unmarked SUV. Agent Sarah Wilson had been investigating the trafficking ring for 3 years, and her arrival meant this reunion had been carefully planned. Daniel Thompson has been in a medically induced coma for 6 months, recovering from traumatic brain injury. He only regained consciousness last week. Marcus Thompson's legs gave out when he saw his son, 2 years of grief and guilt collapsing into overwhelming joy. Father and son held each other in the middle of the forest trail, both men crying without shame as years of pain began to heal. "Vincent told me Daniel was dead," Marcus sobbed. "I saw the body myself." "You saw Robert Mitchell, a hiker Vincent murdered and mutilated to look like Daniel," Agent Wilson explained. Daniel was found unconscious 3 days later by search and rescue, but his head trauma was so severe that he couldn't remember his identity. He's been in a specialized facility, slowly recovering his memories. Eleanor watched the reunion with tears streaming down her cheeks, her hand finding Thomas's as Sarah moved to stand beside them. The family they'd built around loss and healing was suddenly complete in a way none of them had dared hope for. Daniel approached Benny slowly, his movements still careful but filled with purpose. The bear seemed to understand his friend's limitations, settling gently beside the young man as Daniel's fingers moved through familiar sign language. "I'm sorry I was gone so long," Daniel signed, his movements rusty but sincere. "I never stopped loving you." Benny's response was immediate and overwhelming, a complex series of signs that roughly translated to family safe, love forever, home now. "He protected us," Thomas told Daniel, pride evident in his voice. "Your journal, your bear, your father, they all played a part in stopping Vincent's operation. Daniel, your sacrifice saved hundreds of animals and exposed a network we never would have found otherwise." Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his scarred features. "Benny was always the hero. I just tried to be worthy of his friendship." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary grounds, the extended family gathered on the porch. Eleanor in her rocking chair with Benny's massive head resting against her knee, Daniel carefully seated beside his bear with Marcus hovering protectively nearby, Thomas and Sarah's hands intertwined as they watched their impossible dream become reality. "You know," Eleanor said softly, "I think this is what Daniel meant in his journal about love finding new ways to protect what matters. Sometimes the family you need isn't the one you're born into, it's the one that chooses to save you." The Daniel Thompson Wildlife Sanctuary would go on to rescue thousands of animals and educate millions of visitors about the importance of protecting wildlife. But its true legacy would always be the proof that love, courage, and sacrifice could transform even the darkest tragedies into something beautiful and lasting. And at the heart of it all was a bear named Benny, who had carried a young man's words of hope through the darkest wilderness and brought them safely home. Sometimes the most beautiful families aren't born, they're forged in moments of impossible choice, when strangers decide to risk everything for someone who can't speak for themselves. At 74, Eleanor thought her dreams of healing animals were buried with her youth, until a wounded bear named Benny reminded her that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Thomas and Sarah discovered that love doesn't end with divorce papers. It just waits patiently for the right moment to bloom again. Marcus learned that grief can transform into purpose and that honoring his son's memory meant protecting the innocent creatures Daniel died defending. This isn't just a story about saving a bear. It's about how acts of compassion ripple outward, creating families from fragments and hope from heartbreak. In a world that often feels divided and harsh, Benny's story proves that kindness still matters, that courage still counts, and that second chances can come at any age. Your next chapter might be waiting in the most unexpected place, perhaps in someone who needs your protection, your wisdom, or simply your willingness to believe that love always finds a way. What moment in your life reminded you that it's never too late for a fresh start? Have you ever found family in the most unexpected places? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.